MK is the worst thing that could happen to this country. Our constitution is like a closed system. There's a lot of things the ANC could do to win trust, not support. No one sat the night before being like, you know what we really need? We really need a 10-party coalition.
Spread the fire. Welcome back to SMWX. Today, I'm really excited to be joined by Dr. and I emphasize Dr. Rekgotsofetse Chikane, who is lecturer at the WITS School of Governance and also deputy chair of Defend Our Democracy. But most importantly, just here because he's one of the most insightful voices on South African politics today. Doc.
Insightful? That's pressure.
Hey. You were last on this show despite my attempts.
It's been tough times. The country's been going through a lot.
When you're a doc, you know, pressure on your time.
Fair enough, I guess.
I think it was like 2020 or 2019 potentially.
It would have been 2019. It was before COVID.
Yeah.
It would have been 2019 or so. Something like that.
Yeah. Congrats on the PhD.
Yeah, we appreciate it. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah. You know, I'm still trying to make sense of this election.
You and me both.
Yeah, I think we all are. And I wonder now that some of the heat has died down, what you think the significance of this election actually is.
Yeah. My dominant thought is that I beat my dad in a debate. That is the most dominant. So me and my dad have had this ongoing debate since like 2008. I would have been in like grade 11. Which is like, how do you know we're in a democracy if you don't lose? Like, how do you know if like the ANC doesn't lose that like the country won't like burn and fall apart? His argument, which is a good argument, was like it happened during Polokwane, that the entire state machinery essentially changed overnight. We downplay it, but we had ministers disappear overnight. We had chief directors disappear overnight.
Yeah, there was a lot of
There was a complete overhaul of the state, but the state held. And he said, so we know the country won't burn if there's like a change in leadership. And I was like, that doesn't count though, right? Because that wasn't like a choice by the electorate to do that. And the losers of the election didn't lash out. And obviously I was going back to like old African liberation stories about liberation parties and what happens when they lose power. So when this election, and if you remember, I used to like stand on a soapbox being like 2029 will be when the ANC loses.
I remember.
They lose early now. So now all my predictions are out the window.
Yeah.
They lose early and the country still stands. The following day, people went to work, people went to school, hospitals were still running. The army was huddled in their garrison somewhere in the country. And the country kept on moving. And that is such a powerful moment for a country that's 30 years old to have its liberation party come out of formal power. I mean, we've found power in different ways. But to come out of formal power and the country doesn't fall apart. And for me, that's the biggest takeaway from the elections. That's probably the biggest one that gives us that hope and belief that this can carry on happening into the future. That we never have to be the type of country that worries that if you lose an election, something bad might happen. Now, the reasons for that, we could talk about that for hours, whether it is democratic resilience or just there's too many vested interests to allow the country to fail. But that was like my dominant thought now, and it's been sticking with me for like the last, it's been like 3 months, 4 months, for the last little while about it. Yeah, our country's a bit resilient.
That's so interesting because normally I think the way this election has been viewed is in terms of the parties, and we're always so quick to look at the horse trading that happens and who rose and who fell. But actually, this was about the country and said some important things about the country itself, no matter who rose and who fell.
And it's not like I'm sure we might touch on it. It's not as if like the election was stolen, right? This is like a democratic decision. The language I hate is like the country's decided that the parties must work with each other. I hate that language. It's like no one sat the night before being like, you know what we really need? We really need a 10-party coalition. This exact combination of organizations.
We, the country, we want this.
We want this. And we hope that this message transfers easily. But it's this idea that a democratic outcome can showcase that the country is divided, right? Along political lines, to an extent ideological lines, that we have very different interests in political power, that we have a truly competitive multi-party democracy, right? Because our constitution was never designed for like one person to win.
Yeah, yeah.
And that can then showcase itself in the election results. All the beauty of what a liberal democracy is supposed to be, with multiple different parties all jockeying for power with no one having complete control. That's a beautiful thing. Like countries 30 years old could only dream of having this type of outcome. And again, it could be because we are just resilient. It could be because citizens don't care to really fight back if they really don't like the results. That could be the case. I'm pretty sure it's just because there's just too much money involved in the country kind of succeeding, and there's not enough concentration of power linked to political efforts and linked to the military for it to fall apart. But yeah, I think people need to like take stock and be like, we got through this election. Yeah, it's a bit of a all over the place.
Yeah.
But it's a mess that we created, we owned, and we're taking ownership of it.
When you say that, I also think that there were some moments, if you recall, during the results with, for example, MK Party and former President Zuma, where it looked like, well, things might go south. And actually they didn't. And then we kind of forgot that we were even worried that they would at some point. And I think even the fact that, you know, the claims of electoral interference have kind of died down now.
Yeah.
Also says something. You always, I mean, very old democracies will have claims from people who felt like they didn't get enough, that the election wasn't fair. But the question is what happens to those claims? And they didn't really go very far, which I think is good for democracy.
I mean, so there's a lot to say. It was like, what, 5 days where like if particular decisions were made, we could have had a very different outcome, right? So the first and foremost, wasn't the greatest elections, right? Wasn't the greatest performance by the IEC, which is also really frustrating because this has been a trend for the last 3 elections now, right? So dating back to 2016 local elections, that there's just been chinks in the armor, just questions about the efficiency of the IEC, credibility of the IEC. And this is not like a coming just from me. So I love Afrobarometer. So Afrobarometer has been like tracking trust in political institutions for God knows how long now. Yeah. But they've got this particular stat about the IEC, that trust that the population has in the IEC has been dropping from a high of like 80% to like down to 60% or something ridiculous like that. Right? That the electorate is showing the IEC that we are not trusting you anymore. And when that happens, it becomes easier and easier and easier to put doubt in the IEC.
Sure.
Right? So you had this situation where it would be foolish for a party who is clearly not going to win outright. It would be foolish for them not to try and take advantage of that. Right? So for me, MK's choice to highlight the deficiencies of the system and the potential vote rigging, like politically speaking, makes complete sense. Like I get that approach to gaining favor. In particular, if your entire strategy is we want to get rid of this thing called the Constitution and replace it with the parliamentary supremacy. So I get the strategies, but the IEC doesn't help itself. What the IEC does really well, though, is that when, and I'm not sure if you were at the Rock that day Zuma came in and everyone.
No, I was tired by then. I was like, I'm not going back to the Rock.
You see, I can't say people's names, but I was about to leave.
Yeah.
And someone from MK was walking in and he was like, don't leave. This is not, just wait.
Yeah.
So I turn around and I stay, and boom, 45 minutes later, the former president walks in. The whole room shuts down, journalists jumping over each other. Yeah, you could see that energy that was in the room, and then they make their announcement, that big press conference. But it lays down essentially a timeline which is, IEC, you have a couple of hours to respond to us. Essentially, you've got a couple of hours. Are you going to release the results or not? Now, if you didn't have a strong IEC that had the backing of the president as well, and if you didn't have what I suspect, I've got no evidence for this, but I suspect intel of some sort of, you can't delay the count because you're going to create other problems in the country, whether it's a national security concern, whether it is just agitation, or you're creating a vacuum where a vacuum doesn't need to exist. The IEC could have easily said, you know what, let's take an extra few days to do this. Because, I mean, what was the line from the president? What's the rush? I remember when he said that, I was like, yeah, what is the rush? Technically, you've got 10 days to finish this count, I think it's 10 days to finish this count. Like, why are you trying to do it by the end of the weekend? Like, I don't understand. But the IEC stood firm with the last vestiges of political capital that it had in that moment and made a decision of like, no, we won't. We're not going to push back this count. We trust in our processes and we trust to open up our books if anyone wants to come and hold us accountable. And obviously our organization was doing an observation campaign. So we had picked up multiple issues with the elections, but we also came to a similar conclusion like the next day that, yeah, not an easy election, but a free and fair election. But if the IEC had waited a couple days, you would have given so much fuel to MK in particular to ride that wave. But it doesn't happen. MK then goes through the normal procedures, follows the democratic procedures of how to complain about this.
Yeah.
And the democratic procedures come out and say, no, we're good. We're fine here. That's a constitution holding tight. But you needed the IEC to give political capital to the institutions. If they had doubted themselves for just a moment, fundamental change. Fast forward later, our country has a short-term memory, and all of us seem to have forgotten that, like, that was a claim that the elections were stolen in the country. Yeah. But I think there's an implicit belief that, you know, we might not have a perfect election, but it's the election that we have, and we'll kind of claim it and own it. At least in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the other question to come to the political fortunes is just, yeah, this was the one where the ANC did fall below.
What a time to be alive.
I'm telling you. Yeah,
and Jesus didn't come as well. This is the thing. I'm a bit...
Yeah, like, I've been reflecting on this, and I don't think when you're in a turning point moment, it's hard to know whether you are there or not in the present. But for me, it's the provincial picture that actually brings it home to me, right? Because I was looking at who governs which provinces.
Yeah.
And 4 months ago, the ANC had comfortable majorities in 7 of 9 provinces. Now it has a comfortable majority in 3.
Yeah.
And that's just unimaginable, you know, because so a lot of people are focusing on the national picture, but like KZN fell, Gauteng fell, obviously the Western Cape was far behind. So they like completely lost 3. But then for me, like, you know, being very close in another 3, like Mpumalanga,
I mean, they barely held on to Mpumalanga.
Yeah, like barely. Like Mpumalanga, like that's 70% territory.
Yeah.
I think Free State was the other one, which was very close, and they actually fell below 50 in Northern Cape. So like they're just on a knife's edge. So they're only 3. Eastern Cape's always going to vote ANC. Like
they must
like
save themselves. I don't know how to help the Eastern Cape. Shame, I'm going to get so much hate for that.
And then Limpopo as well. And then Northwest, but only 3 provinces. Like that. This was, at least in terms of the electorate, because we'll come on to what the ANC did with the result, which I think was a masterclass.
Best,
but wow, the ANC got absolutely hammered in this election.
So when I look at the electoral map, I look at it like 3 levels. I think we're on the same page for 2, but I want to talk about a third one. So the first one is obviously the national picture.
Yeah.
Right. So I've been doing like a lot of looking at like the numbers. And you see interesting trends across all the parties, but let's kind of focus on the ANC in particular.
Sure.
So you get the ANC's biggest drop. Primarily, the very simplistic argument is, oh, MK stole our votes. Right? I get that argument, but it's too simplistic.
Sure.
Because that argument then assumes that MK took your votes in every single province. But it makes the assumption that every province where you lost votes, MK essentially took your votes. And that just isn't the case. MK's votes are also quite spread out, but they're not concentrated enough to allow the ANC to fall in Northern Cape.
MK didn't do anything in Northern Cape.
They didn't do anything in Northern Cape. The ANC did that to themselves, right? But what makes it specifically interesting for the ANC is that the ANC made a choice at the beginning of this year, or beginning of their campaign, which is we're not trying to go for the urban votes. We're going to go back to our rural votes. So they spend a disproportionate amount of time in rural areas, in particular, campaigning. Urban areas is like, it's just hard. It's hard to get their votes. And one of the arguments, I can't say names, one of the arguments senior members were making were where we lost our votes in the last elections was because our members in rural areas didn't come out to vote. Right. So getting the urban vote and spending money there is not going to work. We'd rather focus on getting the rural vote and sparking our voters to come back. So they didn't come back this election. They firmly stayed at home. MK didn't eat their entire lunch across the entire country. They just ate their lunch in like 3 different provinces, right? So the ANC now needs to reconcile this idea of this kind of national change. The rural vote is not coming out. They can't necessarily rely on it. We're talking about rural Northwest. When you look at the electoral map, rural Northwest, Northern Cape, rural Free State, they're just bleeding, not because people are stealing, but because they're just getting less numbers coming out.
Very interesting.
Right? So they've got a bit of an issue going into the future. The second issue they have, like a national picture, is like, what do you do with MK at this point? The phrase I use with them is like, you guys had Askaris amongst you for 6 months and you couldn't tell. That's mad.
Possibly longer, actually.
Possibly longer.
Yeah.
That is a mad situation that you can have KZN disappear right underneath your nose. And everyone says, oh no, it's the Zuma influence. I'm like, it must be more than that.
It has to be more than that.
It has to be more than that.
I actually asked, because at the results center, there were big debates going on in various places about this. And if, for example, former President Thabo Mbeki decided 6 months before an election, I'm breaking away and I'm starting a new party, right?
We're in this area here.
The Kilani party. It would get some votes, right? But it would, but merely being a former president does not translate into 15%. So I agree with you fully. Like that was one part of it, but there was a lot more to the story that people have just said, well, it's the Zuma effect.
So this gets me to the third one, but let me talk about the provinces. Because the third one I find the most fascinating. It's like a return to old school politics, the hits of the 1980s. So the second one is like the provinces.
Sure.
So let's talk about like the DA for a second. The DA is
the
like
governing party.
Wow. The governing party, because they're not the opposition anymore. They've lost net since 2014, 600,000 votes. Right? So in relative terms, as a percentage, they've grown. Or they've stayed 20, 21.
Fluctuated, let's put it that way.
But in terms of absolute numbers, they've dropped by almost 600,000 votes from their high of 2014. And there's a whole argument for why they were so high back then, become more social, liberal, democratic, and then you get votes DA. So they have a decline. You have the ANC generally losing support as well at a provincial level. So the question then becomes, these two big players, EFF is stagnant, right? They had their rapid growth and then it's kind of okay. So the question then is like, where are all the new parties getting votes from? Because it's not like people are coming out to vote in their droves. Voter turnout is the lowest that it's ever been. So where are the new parties getting their votes from? We know they're not getting it from young people because they're still the least likely to go out and vote. Funny enough, they're the most likely to support you if they vote for you. So young people, if they vote for you the first time, there's a paper by Karen Ransman and Martin Becker, showcase that like South Africans in particular, young people, if they vote for you once, they'll vote for you the second time. They will give you that second option. But you need to convince them to vote, and the barrier to convince them to vote is quite high. So the question then becomes like, where are all these new parties getting their voters from? Right? And that, for me, that provincial picture becomes quite fascinating, where Gauteng is the natural like evolution of kind of competitive democracy happening at the urban center of a country, right? New parties are coming in, the middle class wants new things, people who are rich want new things, the working class, we must talk about the working class of South Africa and the left, but the working class are seeing the issues of the country and can pin it on the ANC in a very tangible way.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. In Mpumalanga doesn't make sense. How does the ANC lose the southern southern area of Mpumalanga in particular? How do they start losing MK in certain urban areas of Gauteng?
Yeah.
So all these questions about like provincial dynamics, I think are interesting, right? But they fall by the wayside to this third image that I have of the electoral map.
Right.
Which is, has anyone noticed that our electoral map looks eerily similar to 1994? Like, it's a crazy, crazy situation where you have this. I mean, back then they didn't use blue for the DA, or for the National Party, but you've got this essentially blue wave on the western aspect of the country. The center is ANC. The east is IFP Zulu, essentially, for lack of a better way of describing it. And we've regressed to that, right? That map was all over the place before, right? We've now regressed to it that it's almost as if, and the voting districts have changed a bit, but if you put the map one-to-one over each other, it almost looks exactly the same. And that should be worrying. Now, you mix that with Patriotic Alliance going from 6,000 votes in 2019 to 300,000 votes 2024 in that kind of central Western Cape region in the main. Then you have MK being very kind of Zulu nationalist in their posture. You then get this renewed return to like ethno-nationalism in the country. So the question then becomes, how did we come back to pre-1994 divides in the country? Yeah, we've got a constitution that makes it look different, feel different. We can intermix with each other. We can hang out. There's multiracialism. The Springboks are nice. Everyone's in love. But the map shows us that we've just gone backwards. And the question for me is, do we stay that way? Does politics stay that way in the country? Or has politics always been that way? It was just masked by ANC dominance. And why I pose that question, and I also look at all the other parties that contested, this is why I think this map becomes interesting about what the next, maybe not local elections, but the next national elections will look like, is you now know for sure that kind of being I describe it as like a Rainbow Nation party will not win you votes in this election. You're either old guard, because all the old guards, they walked out of this election a bit battered and bruised. In real terms, only the IFP grew, which is a crazy, this kind of showcases, again, this eastern block of the country. But if you're old guard, you should be fine. If you're a brand new party, you better be ethno-nationalist. You better have a very clear agenda about who in the country you represent. And if you don't have a clear idea of who in the country you represent, you won't get votes. And what I worry is that that electoral map will create a mushrooming of new parties that follow that playbook. Now, it could change. We might get a COPE in 2019 that goes back to like multiracial, Rainbow Nation type politics of we're all united. But there's no room in our politics for that anymore. And that is worrying, because I don't know where we'll get the new one from.
Sam, I just wanted to interrupt this episode to let you know the 4 ways you can help SMWX. Way number 1, you can invite me to speak at your institution or company. Way number 2, you can advertise on this channel. Way number 3, you can become a member of this channel. The link to the membership is down below. And number 4, you can buy merch, that's books or hoodies. Now let's get back to the episode. All our contact details are in the description box below. That's interesting, it's very interesting. And to some extent, I think it also stems from the crisis of what non-racialism came to be associated with. It's obviously a term that has a proud history, but I think it,
No,
in
you're
some
giving
ways,
away my next book now.
oh,
I've figured out what the topic is going to be.
okay.
And it's on this thing of like, the reason why we haven't solved it is that we've assumed that we're all on the same page about what this means.
Absolutely. And if we're not on the same page, then certain powerful forces have co-opted the term.
Yeah.
Because remember, I'm afraid to say it, the DA is all about non-racialism.
They're
right?
really all about it.
Yeah.
More than most parties.
Yeah, exactly. Like
Whether they do it is
yeah,
another
yeah,
thing.
Yeah, but like they profess. And we've actually lost sight of a vision of true racial justice and equality. And people have actually lost faith in non-racialism. Now, in the absence of that more bold vision of what a just society looks like,
Yeah.
you can just then lapse back into the easy identitarian way of doing things. And because we don't have any politics that's giving us the alternative to the fake non-racialism,
Yes.
here we are.
I mean, it's a crazy thing. I mean, I could talk about this for hours. So you get like 12 different forms that are linked to organizations or cultures of the country or identities of the country of this idea called non-racialism. Like, so quick examples of a few of them. You get what I describe as like the DA's liberal non-racialism.
Right, right.
You get the ANC's approach to non-racialism, which is, if we can find someone of another race, it would be nice to be amongst our ranks. But like, we're not going to actively seek this out in any particular way. The greatest example of this was the conference, the ANC's funny, the ANC's national conference, and Tina Jomat Peterson being nominated. And I remember in the room someone saying that, no, Nomvula can't go uncontested because that's a crazy situation, because technically on paper, she would then be the leader of the party for 24 hours. And everyone's like, we refuse to let that happen. So you need to contest. And then someone said something that I was like, this is a wild thing to say. And it's very simple. No, historically, the DSG must always be a colored woman. Since 1994. And they're like, no, then we must keep that going then. So then it is, who is in the room at this point?
Yeah.
Tina Joma Peterson.
That's the most ANC story
It's the most
I've ever heard.
like, it's such simple logic. And you're like, yeah, I get, I see how you got there, right? But the question then becomes, is that non-racialism at that point? Right? You then get Springbok non-racialism, which is like the greatest.
Springbok non-racialism.
It's like taking, I don't take drugs, but I imagine it's like a drug for the country. It is this belief system of like what the country could be if the economic situation kept staying the same. That's that version of non-racialism,
exactly.
right?
Like, that's so true. It's like, if we don't change the fundamentals, but we all just get along.
We all just get along.
Then
that's it.
Then we would win.
Yeah. Right. And look at us, how nice we are, and then pay 2,000 Rand for a rugby ticket. But that's a story for another day, right?
Yeah.
Right. So you get these different notions. The EFF has its own particular approach. They won't use the term non-racialism, but they've got their particular approach to understanding it.
Yeah.
And all of these notions.
There's PAC non-racialism. The term actually
comes from the PA. Yeah.
Like Sobukwe speaks a lot about non-racialism, as in racialism is when you categorize people and treat them and discriminate against them. Therefore, non-racialism is when you don't do that and you subvert that system. So there's a very radical non-racialism as well. Well, that's where it started, right?
But it's now been, I can't even say co-opted. Yeah. It's just all these notions have competed to such an extent that...
The Patriotic Alliance probably also supports non-racialism.
Yeah, it's non-racialism for us here, type of thing, right? But you compete, these notions of non-racialism compete so much with each other that they grind each other out into nothing.
Yeah.
Right. So you're left without anything, and therefore there's no way to then build a identity for the country.
So true.
Everyone is like, we want to build some sort of South African identity. I was like, no, wait, guys, we actually don't have to do that. We just need to know where we all stand on certain questions and say it with your chest. The problem that we have is that we're all clinging onto our different notions without realizing it and trying to homogenize them into this one image. And it just doesn't work. And there's ramifications. So our elections, in my mind, are like a symbiotic of that, or symbolic of that, rather. Where it goes in the future, I'm not entirely sure. But again, I could talk about this for hours.
Yeah, we've got time. We've got time. It's a very interesting one, because there's also non-racialism as a founding value in the Constitution. And then you're like, well, I see why this was important then. But if the term has been so decimated now, then how do we come back to the Constitution, which then founds this value and actually give it meaning when everyone seems to have, pulled the meaning so far apart? So maybe some of the constitutional critiques are not really about what the Constitution says, but what has been done to the terms that had meaning back then.
So I'm trying to remember if you wrote about this in your book or not.
Yeah, I did. I said non-racialism.
You said no, not this particular.
Oh, right. I was like, non-racialism.
So I was reading and if your viewers don't know him, Gillard Isaacs, right, from IEJ, Institute of Economic Justice.
Economist. Yeah.
I'm writing a paper. I stumbled upon his PhD. Right. So shout out to Gillard, right?
Yeah.
So I decided, let me read his PhD, right? Because I'm trying to figure something out. And he has a stat in his PhD. He's tracking the evolution of the financial system in South Africa during the 1980s in particular.
Yeah.
And he uses this idea of in South Africa, there's the minerals energy complex. But he extends it and says it's actually a minerals energy financial complex. And he makes, when someone says something and you're like, that can't be right. This stat is too crazy for me to even begin comprehending. And he says, in 1984, 80% of the JSE's market cap was owned by 6 companies.
Yeah. I do.
You do touch on that.
I know the exact word. You've gone, absolutely.
And you're just like, that's a crazy number.
Yeah.
Right? That's a crazy, crazy number. So I decided, let's go find out what the market cap looks like now.
Yeah.
It's taken a while. All these companies have merged and demerged and acquired and this and this and this and that.
Yeah. I know what chapter you're speaking of.
Yes, right?
Yeah.
So you're sitting at still 60% still within this sector.
Absolutely.
Essentially. And the question then becomes, how do you possibly build a multiracial country when that's still the case? It's almost impossible, right? Because those sectors predominantly support the white population of the country in the main. They don't create employment for the black populace of the country because there's no downstream manufacturing that connects to it. There's no downstream supply chains that connect to it. If you're a mine, you take coal out and you take it out the country.
Sure.
If you're energy, you take coal out and then you burn it and then and then we make money that way. And if you're finances, you manage the trades, right? Yeah. No bank is going to be the biggest employer in the country. No mine is going to be the biggest employer. You also then stop all innovation that is linked to your sectors because your sectors are very closed off and they're oligopolies, so they don't necessarily want to innovate. There's no competition in the sector. So we're clinging onto all these other things, but you're sitting with a situation where it's 60+% of the country is in poverty. You don't have the time to undergo there's no tools to do that structural change to the economy so long as that exists. And if you can't do that, and because of the racial structure of our economy, it means that we're forever going to be divided outside of, remember when I used to talk about that white hue of the rainbow, right?
Yeah.
Outside of those particular areas where people intermix or just hang out with each other. So it becomes crazy. So you then go back to the Constitution and be like, who wrote this? Who wrote this back in 96 when it was still fresh? It wasn't 30 years later where you're like, we never saw it. They were there. And you could still write that into that notion of non-racialism, to write that there's no escape clause, right? To be after 30 years, we're going to revisit this thing and be what's going on?
Yeah. Yeah.
But to write, and it's not to throw shade at anyone who wrote the Constitution back then. It was a tough situation. You had to write what you had to write, and it had benefits. We had the democracy that we have now. No shade against them.
Yeah.
But I can still, in the same breath, be like, why? Like, why did that happen? And it becomes, this is why I'm like very partial to the argument of like a second republic or changing the Constitution. Not all of it, but there's key aspects to it where you're just like, that's wild. Like, you should be able to adjust this idea that non-racialism is not just the idea that we hang out with each other, that it should be linked to some sort of social justice, right? Underpinned by that. And then let's have the debate about what that social justice looks like.
Yeah.
And that debate is allowed to change. If we decide 30 years from now, our notion of justice in the country is different, then we should be free to have that conversation. But we should also have a constitution. I'm not a constitutionalist, but I want a country that like survives and thrives. It doesn't just like scrummage around hoping for the best and the benevolence of certain people's hearts, but you give people the opportunity to then reestablish what social justice looks like in your country. Other democracies allow that to happen. Our constitution is like a closed system. Like what was created must therefore last into perpetuity. I mean, the American elections, and not to use America as like a bar, but like Trump really screwed over the Democrats, right? Because he came in and he changed the Supreme Court bench. He changed what is the social justice compass of the country, and he made it more right. So regardless of what policy changes you do, that now for the next generation, that is the new principles that the Constitution of the United States is going to follow. These mechanisms to do that, I don't know what our mechanism is in the country. Like I legitimately, no one can tell me what that mechanism would be. Maybe a GNU will do it. We'll find out very, very soon. But so when I think about things like that, I come back, so coming all the way back to the elections. I think about how the elections and that map is the natural outcome of a society trying to find out what its identity or its sense of social justice is. And it is now retreating back to what it knew when the Constitution was trying to change it into something else. The Constitution tried to change it into something else. Society then had no say about continuous say. So they had an immediate say, but they had no continuous say about this. And because of these two things, the society is naturally regressing back to these old patterns, right? Kind of Zulu nationalism, colored nationalism, the Western Cape being predominant, Western Cape,
you know what I've
free
just
state.
realized though with your thing? I don't know if you've also thought about this, but
Tell me more.
But we also have a GNU. So we've gone back
Exactly.
to 94
We've
in terms
literally
of the map, but
returned.
Also, how government is going to respond to that map. We went back to the exact same playbook.
The exact same situation.
Yeah.
Almost as if, and now back then was, I'm glad that you pointed it out like that. Back then it was like forced upon us.
Yeah.
Right? It was forced. It was constitutionally mandated. Forced is not the nice word. It was constitutionally mandated, right? And I think it was a good thing to do back then. So you can see the ANC returning back to the playbook and be like, let's try it, let's run it back.
Exactly.
Let's run it back.
I think there's a book somewhere in the shelf.
Someone who's written the blueprint how to get out of this. But we've now...
Oh my gosh, Cyril Ramaphosa is at the center of both moments as well. Anyway, this is crazy.
The country's returned back to what made sense.
Yeah.
At that moment in which it could determine what its principles around justice are. And this opportunity for me for the next 10 years provides us the scope. And this is why I'm like, don't just take the GNU at face value. Right? Don't let them run off into a distance and govern in silence, because they will use this moment to set the tone again.
Absolutely.
Right? And then we're stuck for another 30 years. That we can use this moment, whether it's the national dialogue, whether it is through democratic elections, whether it is that I can now hold people in parliament accountable, which is a great thing, which you've never been able to do before as like ordinary citizens.
Crazy times.
Crazy times. To do the crazy things such as, I'm a big proponent of this, electoral reform. Right? We fundamentally, back then, the principle around proportional representation was a necessity, or not a necessity. It was an outcome of the time, but not necessarily the best system you could utilize for the country. Change it now. This is our window to make these value changes of, I want to hold a person accountable, not a party accountable. That's a value, so like a justice, value-laden determination. You can look at other pieces of the Constitution about should they be provinces? This is the time to have that conversation. Should they be provinces in the country? Should you have our Concord judges on terms, right? Can we elect them in different ways? Can we select them in different ways? And these are the conversations I think the GNU allows us to have, or at least this moment allows us to have, to really inquire about what is our country's idea of justice, so that whoever competes, whoever gets power the next time around, they must now live with this reality, essentially. But I don't think we've realized that, even though we've brought ourselves back to that moment ourselves without anyone forcing us.
I'm extremely curious to know, on a slightly different tack.
Yeah.
What do you make of the ANC and the DA collaborating? Like,
I think it's fun. I think it's fun.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, man. I don't mind. You know things I don't mind? I actually don't mind the DA. I actually don't mind the DA. Because you know what? The DA just does DA things. They're very predictable.
Why are you saying it like it's like back pain or something?
Like, it is. It took me a while to get there.
I don't mind.
I don't mind them. I don't mind them. Like, they go about their business.
Yeah.
They also are who they are. It's the one thing that I appreciate. Sure. They are who they are. They haven't tried to change. Well, no, they tried for a few years. So let's go back to what I was talking about, the 600,000 voters. 2014, their peak, Helen Zille's in power. DA makes a shift in those 5 years before. So they're moving on from what's his name? Tony Leon?
Yeah.
They're moving on from the Tony Leon days. They're becoming more social liberal in their ideological output. A lot of this informed by like internal changes. So their policies start changing.
Yeah.
Right? These policies become more collective in their thinking, right? So back then they were in favor of NSFAS. It was like, how do we do NSFAS better? How do we expand it, right? They were in favor of EPWP programs. How do we expand these social protection mechanisms? And they got the highest votes they've ever gotten. They then changed tack. They try and get Musi to come in to take over. Helen goes into a corner, then comes back later. They start introducing new voices, which is a conversation for another day, into their body politics. But all in all, they are who they are. We represent a particular constituency. Yeah. We'll represent the idea that we can govern better by giving particular constituency services, and we'll ride this wave. It has a hard ceiling, right? But we just need to work between the space of where we are and where that hard ceiling is. Yeah. They've never lied to us. The ANC lies to us. That's the thing. The first time I heard about renewal, I was still in the youth league back in 2011. That was the first time I heard about, no, the ANC needs to go through renewal. I remember it was 2011, and then 2013 was the decade of the Keda. Was it 2013? Right? So the party lies, and this is something I talk to my dad about a lot. Like, the party lies to itself, and then thinks the electorate isn't noticing this. So now you have two organizations. One that is clear about who it is, right? They've become a bit more apologetic, but they're clear about who they are, and they finally get keys to the car, right? That I could drive this car. And then you get the ANC that isn't sure of who it is. It really is not sure. And it's just too big of a party to have that clear identity of who it is. And it's seeing the impacts of this. Who says to the DA, no, you can't have the keys of the car because you've never driven this car before. So sit in the passenger seat. And the DA is looking at them and be like, but you're drunk. Like, you're drunk. You don't know who you are. You don't know where you are. You've got internal things that are causing issues. And now we must drive in this car together.
And you have a history of accidents.
A history of accidents. And now we must drive in this car together. And in the back seat, you have all these other parties who are sitting there being backseat drivers. And now the DA has to make a choice of, do I get out of this car that could be an accident waiting to happen, right? But I never know if I could get back into this car. Do I hope that the ANC has a crash that is not like a terminal crash, but allows me to then take over the reins?
Just for
a little bit,
yeah.
right? That it gets enough people in the backseat to be like, nah, that was mad crazy. We're not doing that again, type of thing, right? And so I've been using this analogy in my head to kind of describe their relationship of they're kind of stuck with each other, right? Where the DA can't leave the GNU. They have to work with the ANC.
Absolutely.
Right? They don't like, and I keep telling my students of like, ignore the Bella Bill. Right? Like the Bella Bill is like a distraction. The DA was forced into being more public about it in a time in which they want to be very silent about big issues,
right,
because we're negotiating the budget now. We're negotiating a budget that will inform my policy program for the next 3 years if I stay in government. So the toing and froing of negotiations can't happen over pieces of legislation that were already going to come and pass. But the Bella Bill became too politically salient for them to ignore. So the DA has to hold tight. They have to eat dirt every now and again. But they know the ANC will do ANC things. And the ANC will trip itself up. Right? Because the ANC lies to itself about its internal problems. And they'll wait for that opportunity. Now, the ANC understands that I'm not allowed to drive this car by myself anymore.
Yeah.
Right? I need the DA here, because without the DA, then I must talk to 8 other organizations. Right? So the masterstroke of the ANC for the GNU was getting to that 70% marker. That's the masterstroke. Because at that point, it is, and I forget the number in the seats in parliament, but it is, in order to form a government at that point, I just need one other party who's not the DA, even if it's like a small, lower party. And Action SA is waiting for you there.
Sure.
ACDP is waiting for you there. And there's a third party that I'm missing now that's waiting on the wings, or not aligned to the Progressive Caucus, but not in the GNU.
Right.
So it puts the DA in a tough negotiating position of, if I leave this government, it's not like the government will collapse.
Yeah.
The ANC will just find another partner.
Yeah.
But the ANC realizes, but then I must go through the politics that we've been going through at local elections of trying to negotiate with all the small parties. It's a tough thing. It doesn't work. Local elections show us that in both urban areas, rural areas. The Mr. Reports, which is a great report if anyone wants to know about coalitions at a local level and how they function over the last 5 years. They did a fantastic report. It showcases that if it is one dominant party and, I was going to say Mickey Mouse parties, and then smaller parties, right, chaos ensues.
Right.
ANC doesn't want that. So you need to keep that DA there, right? But the longer you keep the DA there, the more internal squabbles you create for the party. So we're going to have this situation going forward for the next 2 years up until local elections.
Yeah.
And for me, my markers are, I think they will get through the next budget, right? So they'll get to Feb, right? Because there's too much at stake. Right? There's too much money at stake about policy program. If you want to do like systemic policy programs that you can like put your flag on and be like, this is me, then it's going to be 2 to 3 years. And you need to secure the budget to do that. So if they get past that, then it becomes the ANC's policy conference. And the ANC, can they get through their policy conference next year?
Is it next year?
It should be in June. It's usually June, halfway between terms. So it should be June, July next year.
I think we get through that as well.
Yeah, right. The ANC's policy conference they're not designed for like big leadership, because you can't vote for leadership. They're not designed, but they set the tone for what the fight for leadership will be. The players show their heads at that point to be like, I am showing interest into doing this, into taking leadership of the organization. So the ANC needs to get past their policy conference. And then once both of these parties have gotten past that, they must now work together towards the local elections. And I think by that point, the gloves will be off.
I think the DA has, in 2026, sorry.
Yeah.
I think the DA will have a leadership election in 2026 as well.
Yeah, they have to, don't they?
Yeah, I think they have it like roughly every 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, so it would have to, I thought it was next, it is 2026. Either back end of next year, 2026. So they have to.
But I think that's also fine.
That's fine. Like, let's see how John goes.
I think the knives were out for John. And he defied very low expectations.
John better go to Zuma and be like, thank you so much.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you've distracted from the fact that, like, if you guys didn't emerge, we weren't getting new voters in any particular way. And it would have been egg on their face. I think John is fine. I say John like I know him personally. I think there will be a leadership squabble, but I think the center of the DA is strong. The John, kind of Gordon Lewis, and they're not super close, but the Gordon Lewis, Zilla, I think they're strong. There's some new actors who are interesting. But this is internal DA politics. But that's for them. I don't think these are...
I think they're going to wait for the next...
They'll wait for the next thing. Yeah. They need to get past the local elections.
Yeah, agreed.
And if I was the DA, if I was advising them, it would be like, close down ranks. Whatever internal squabbles you have, you need to win Joburg outright. You need to try and win Joburg.
Interesting.
You need to try and win Tswana. You need to get these metros and you need to hold tight.
So let's talk about the local election, because I think that will be quite important.
Yeah.
Like, because I'm with you. I think I call it the coalition government.
The grand coalition.
Yeah, whatever you want to call it.
They just call themselves a GNU. I was like, technically.
It's just not.
I don't know.
Whatever. Yeah.
All the textbooks tell me that it's not, but it is what it is.
But okay. Yeah. This situationship. I can see it. I can definitely see it lasting until 2026, which may actually be 2027, because the last election was in November, and it can be 90 days after that.
I follow that.
Could go into, and I can see that they would want to push the election as far as possible.
Yeah.
So we could be talking Feb 2027 or whatever. But then things get really interesting, because then it's like, at least the way I'm looking at it, and I see there was a poll recently, I don't know exactly what it said, but to my mind, both the ANC and the DA have to do well in that election. Because if one drops or doesn't do well, then suddenly they turn around and they're like, hold on, but now you're benefiting at our expense.
Yeah.
So it no longer makes electoral sense. If they both do well, which is quite a big ask, because I can't remember the last election where they both did really well, then it'll be like the country saying, keep going.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a nice way to think about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I can see the DA doing relatively well.
Yeah, I just don't know what's going to happen with the ANC.
I can't see the ANC doing well.
Really? You think it could fall further?
I don't see what's the change? Like, what's the change between now and 2026 that would really make the electorate be like, no, times are good. What the GNU will show people would be like, wow, coalitions are nice here at a national level. Now I want to keep it at that level, right? But the local one, we've now got the experience of like, one person was win here.
Yeah.
But the guys who joined the GNU maybe made the country better. Therefore, maybe let's put them in power at a local level. There's nothing that it's not. I was about to say there's nothing that the ANC can do. There's a lot of things the ANC could do to win trust, not support. Getting the support of the electorate is neither here nor there for the ANC. It's the trust of the electorate, the trust and the support to then go out and vote. But to get that trust back would require a monumental change in the party, right? Yet the party still does things such as people who are implicated in state capture still being in power. VBS is a fascinating thing. I find it a fascinating situation.
Oh, yes.
But the poor minister, I look at her and I'm just like, I mean, technically you didn't do anything wrong. Like, technically, you haven't done, on this particular issue, you haven't done anything illegal. But you should still step down because it's a conflict of interest. And that alone, you should have the integrity to say, I'm going to step down. And two, you can't lead, you create a distraction for government and an entire department because of your actions, which then jeopardizes the nation itself, right? And to not have the wherewithal as well as the ability to reflect on your own actions to say that is not in the best interest of the country. And then to also have a party that doesn't see these two things as well tells you that the party is still in its old tendencies, right? That culture in the party hasn't fundamentally shifted.
Sure.
And the citizens see it. The minister situation is like at a national level, but people are seeing it at a local government level. They see it all the time. The breakdown in trust in public institutions is not a matter of happenstance that it just came out of nowhere. It's because people have seen this happen over time. So for me, that's why I don't think the ANC will do better in local elections unless they do that cleanse, like a full-on cleanse, a big change in the party.
Yeah, that's not happening.
But that's not going to happen. So I've got no reason to believe why they would magically do well.
That's really interesting because for me, and I want to get on to EFF and MK as we round this off, because we've just realized we've been talking for an hour without realizing, is fam, you asked for some SMWX merch and we have delivered. I know you're always looking for ways to help support and grow this channel. So why don't you buy yourself an SMWX hoodie? Super comfy, super warm, and you can represent SMWX. You can check the link down below for how to buy your SMWX hoodie and help build and grow this channel so we can bring you more interviews, more analysis, and more educational insights. Now let's get back to it. I think 2026 for the ANC will be like, either we got decimated in 2024 and we bounce back and that was an aberration. That was a far fall, right? Like, and the question for me is that far fall, was that far fall like the floor? And then maybe, you know, even a young 42 would feel good after that, you know?
Just get 44, 45, you know, maybe I can get up there. Yeah.
You know? But if they fall further, then that cements that like it's game over. It's game over for the party, right? And then really people start thinking like, wow, that wasn't just a once off. Like we are like heading for oblivion here, you know? And then you use that and go into a 2027 conference where there's a lot of anger that in the last 5 years, we have just lost everything electorally. We've somehow kept power.
You have to keep, you have to try and keep power to keep interest.
And they've done really well to keep, like, master. President, deputy, finance, Durko, Gauteng, they somehow hung on to power in KZN.
Makes no sense.
How the ANC clung on to power.
So, I mean, they will, whoever's they negotiated.
Now the negotiating
They
team
negotiated well. Every time I look at it, I'm just like, no wonder the DA was so pressed.
No,
and so touched about it.
If I'm ever in a bind, and I need that ANC negotiating team.
So
I'll be like, so you got 30% for this test. Yeah, but I still deserve to graduate.
So in my mind, they had to keep power because there's too many mouths to feed. Right? The entire political system is kind of built off internal ANC patronage. If they get less than 40%, I still think they would always try and create a GNU to keep that power in. The big moment for them is you get less than 40%. You get less than 40%, but you can't form your own government. That becomes a crisis for them, where you're now sitting as an opposition. The ANC will then do that internal cleanse. It'll be very quick.
Yeah, it'll have to.
But it'll be very vicious, but it would have to do it. The issue is MK.
Yeah, let's go there because I'm interested in what you make of MK and what they could mean in 2026.
I'll say it with my chest, and then I'm gonna get so much hate for it. MK is the worst thing that could happen to this country.
Hematot.
It is the worst thing. Because it's not that it's a new party that represents a particular region of the country, that represents particular beliefs. I really could care less about parliamentary supremacy. I'm kind of partial to it because I'm like, yeah, maybe parliamentary supremacy could do better if we had a core sense of what justice is. It's the fact that you're trying to rewrite history and we're comfortable with that. That we can rewrite history as if the last 14 years never happened. That the bad actors of the last 14 years were all saints. That our economic system somehow was thriving in the early 2010s. That you could rewrite history to such an extent, day after day after day, that people believe you at this point. And that is dangerous for our democracy. Right? That is the same thing of someone being like, it was so nice during apartheid. And you're like, no, it wasn't. But like, I was still a child. But I imagine someone's like, no, man, I was there. I lived through it. It was not a nice thing to go through. And the country is pretending as if we didn't live through the 2010s, where we had negative growth year on year, unemployment went up, poverty went up, inequality went up, wealth inequality went up. We had load shedding almost every single year except like 2013, 2015, something like that, right? You have Johannesburg. I love Johannesburg Water. We watched Johannesburg Water go from one of the best municipal entities to now going into disrepair during that period. This is not like over the last 2 years. This is over 10 years. You see, one of the only countries in the whole world that decided to say, you know what we should really do as a country? Let's sit down and talk about corruption and how systemic it is. And let's have a big commission on this thing. You know how crazy that is? Right? Countries don't do that. They don't sit back being like, corruption is so bad that we need to talk it out now. We went through all of that. We went through SARS being used as a personal bank account. Yet MK gives the image as if that didn't happen. And that I find dangerous. I find it disingenuous, right? I don't mind MK. I think MK is like a good organization. It's multi-party democracy, but that politics of deception, I think is dangerous in this country. The second reason why I really dislike MK in certain instances is they then bring back old people who were the troublemakers before. Right? Or you don't have the wherewithal, and I like that word, to be like, we're not going to have an impeached judge to lead our party. Right? Because that's not where our bar should be. Right? But when you bring the bar down there, what you're essentially saying is that politics, the quality of politics is already the pits, and therefore will entrench being in the pits at this point.
Wow.
And that's what I dislike. And for me, it's like, if you're a young person and you've been complaining that politics isn't representative, that people don't represent you, that the quality of our leaders are bad, that the quality of our democratic discourse is not great, why would you go back to the old, I want to say the old hits of the past that didn't do it back then, right? Why would you retreat back to that? Yet they got 14%. And you can't ignore that, right? And they're not going anywhere. I mean, I really hope they go to a conference. I need them to be a bit more organized. But that scares me as well. Now, if MK goes off, they go to conference, they organize internally, they become an actual organization with structures that are tangible, not like by a whim. I think they will be important in our democracy going forward. I think they create that balance of different conceptions of what justice looks like in the country, right? Their arguments, I mean, they make the argument that they represent the progressive caucus. And I love that argument. We represent, technically, if the ANC came, it would be 70% and we represent the country. Fully agree with them, right? All the breakaways from the ANC, if they all just went to therapy and got on with things, we could have a very different country, right? So I believe in that. I believe in their policies, or certain policies around how do you extend workers' rights? How do you extend decolonial thought within the country, right? I don't agree with how they talk about like legal frameworks of the country. I think it's a bit reductionist,
sure,
right? But like, I can look at a party and disagree with certain policies and agree with certain policies, but my issue is not about your policies, it's the people who are there.
And the narrative.
And the narrative, and that you're trying to gaslight me into believing that you were our saviors in the past, we should go back to you. Because that's what gaslighters do. And it's never better. And to retreat back to where we come from, like that, we just consolidated our democracy. Now we want to go back to the past. And if they carry on with that, I think they then become the biggest danger in our country. You keep our country in stasis. You keep our country in the malaise of 20, I know I'm all energetic about this, but you keep us in the malaise of the country that started in around like 2004, 2005, up until now. Just 20 years of nothing. Just a World Cup. A World Cup. But in terms of like real tangible changes in people's lives, just neither here nor there. So to try and tell us that the people who are instrumental during that period must now also be the people who become the future leader, the potential future leaders of the country, it frustrates me. It makes me tired. Also, can we just get young leaders? I just don't understand. I just can't support that type of politics in the country.
Yeah.
And that's my 2 cents on MK.
No, that's that's hectic. And, you know what I'm just thinking? I'm like, I think this is going to go viral.
Well, we'll find out.
Yeah, exactly. But it's interesting.
Even the crew at the back was like, wow.
Yeah, I was just like, we found our headline. No. But seriously, I think it's an important intervention, because I think the critique of MK is actually part of what is the mainstream critique of MK is part of what is driving MK, because MK thrives in many ways off of being vilified for the wrong reasons, having News 24 swart gevaring them, right? And then they just say, hey, News 24 is swart gevaring us. Therefore, you should come
Support
with us, right?
Yeah.
But we do need a critique of MK that doesn't come from that quarter, right? And I think that's healthy.
I mean, I think so. I don't like and I hope you notice that I never once used Zuma at any point, right? Because I hate the critique of MK being like, because of Zuma and Zuma this. And it's like, it's not Zuma. It's everything that represents that era of our country. And I put the ANC in that same bucket. I mean, which is why like them losing, you deserve that because of what this period indicates about this malaise of the country. And no one can come and tell me that during that period, any central leader in government during that time can now become our savior.
Yeah.
But to essentially pretend that no one went through that's a crazy, crazy thing. I think their strategy is smart, though. Their strategy is, we'll keep taking you guys to the Concord. And we'll take whatever frivolous thing we want to take to the Concord, because we want the Concord to shut us down. Time after time after time. And when we come to elections, we'll have an entire laundry list of, look at all the changes we wanted to do. And the enemy here wasn't the ANC. The enemy here was the Constitutional Court. Therefore, put us in power so we can get rid of that thing. It's a brilliant strategy. A huge respect for it. And it will win you votes because we've seen it work all over the world. That type of, you don't need to attack the party, you attack the institution and the culture the institution represents. It is good old-fashioned, can you call MK right? But it's indicative of the blueprint of the right across the world over the last 15 years. That it's not, the party is not the issue, it's the culture of the country, the institutions that hold up the country, that allow the worst of the worst, the least well-off of society to be treated so badly. So I think it's a brilliant strategy. It's just the people and the rewriting history that, they can't sell me on that. But good luck, though.
In closing, what do you think of where the EFF is right now? Because interestingly, we've had the movement of Chivambu from the EFF to MK, which was came out of the blue.
That made news. I was in the UK at the time when that made news. And even people in the UK were talking about it. I said, Floyd, you are powerful, sir.
No.
The streets of Brixton are talking about you.
That one caught me off guard. I'm not going to lie. Great weeks for the channel.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah. But yeah, what do you make of where they are? Because they've had an internal shake-up. A stagnation, I think, is the right way to put it. I don't think that they fell very far in this election, nor did they grow. They went from I think they fell 1.4 percentage points.
Right?
Yeah. But yeah, whether the EFF for you.
So EFF, I need to look at their numbers a bit more closely. So there's always been the narrative of the EFF that they've got this weird problem with their voter base. And once they turn 27, 28, they stop voting for the EFF. Right? I like joking that they stop paying taxes. And it's nah, I can't. I can't do this, right? But there's the EFF needs to figure that out about how to make our voter base not just young. How do we get young professionals in urban areas to vote for us so that you're not the third consideration for local politics? Ekurhulenis may be an exception, but how do you become more competitive in urban politics and then use the same playbook that the DA uses, right? Just give people services where you can and where you're able, and then fly your flag over those services. Yeah. So the EFF has this challenge of they need to grow their voter base, they need to diversify their voter base, right? And that's why the stagnation is taking place. All their growth potential was swallowed up by MK as well, which is an interesting argument. I buy it, but I also don't buy it at the same time. But for the EFF, all of that being said, I think they could do well. I think, again, it's another coming to a Damascus moment they need to have with themselves. When's their conference? December?
Yeah.
When's it happening? They're going to need to have a Damascus moment as a party about what they want to be over the next 5 years. Because now you've got your foundation. You're not like Cope, right? You're not like a Cope, you're not like a Nahang, you're not like a UDM. You've got a firm base that you'll always be you're now amongst the IFPs and the FF pluses of the world. You will always get votes of 4 to 8%, depending on how the electorate is feeling during the election. The question is, how do you take advantage of an ANC that's now bound to the DA?
Yeah.
Right? How do you make inroads by riding on the code waves, and this is a choice for them, of MK, but where MK can't actually govern because MK is not a party in its formal sense and has very little experience in that regard, right? How do you leverage that moment and plant your flag where the successes are? Can you turn into this mature opposition party and be what's the phrase? Not de facto, what's the other term?
De jure?
De jure. Is it de jure? Yeah, de jure opposition party. Right? I might have gotten them backwards.
Yeah,
but yeah.
De facto, right.
The de facto, yeah, because the de jure opposition party is MKP, and the de facto one can be EFF.
Sure.
And if you can play that role well, you then create out of nowhere an alternative in 2029. Right? Where the electorate might be well, that GNU was crazy. That was a wild 5 years. We did not like this at all. And MK will do MK things. But if you can showcase that you are a legitimate third option from that GNU, because all of them will die by the sword together, if possibly, I think they could do well. But it depends about who Malema surrounds himself with, who he elevates to his level. Does he find a replacement for Floyd, or does he stick to his word and everything comes to his office? Does it become his fiefdom? If it becomes his fiefdom, I've got so many bad things to say about parties. If it becomes his fiefdom, he will then become General Holomisa for the rest of his life. Right? Because that's what happened with UDM. It became a person's fiefdom, right? And then you don't grow from that ever again. But if you can showcase that there is really good leaders. I am the face of this party, and he rightfully should be the face of this party. But here are my 6 deputies who are national household names, who represent the will of the party without me having to be in the room. If they can focus on that, you then ensure that you are the official opposition for the next 5 years. The question is like, can the party do that? And the parties that are able to do that are the ones that do well. The DA does that. There's household names of the DA, right? The EFF, not so much, right? ANC, obviously household names. MK even has household names. But if the EFF can figure out a way of saying, how do we keep Malema in power without it becoming a fiefdom for him, his plaything, and then obviously provide services at a local level where you are able to govern. I think they're in like an interesting time period. I don't think they'll regress. I could live to regret this statement. I really hope I don't, because I really want the EFF, I want them, that magical number of 15% is my number for them, because it changes the electoral outlook of the country completely. DA 20, EFF 15, ANC 39 point whatever that they have, just creates for fascinating politics at that point. And also, the last thing I'll say on it, EFF is the only party right now in my mind, could have been Rise, I think Rise could have done it, but it's the only party that can break that electoral map that we were talking about. It's the only party that can show that our country is not the West Bloc, the Central Bloc, the East Bloc. I think they're the only party that can do it at scale. I think Rise Mzansi, shame, it was tough for them, but I think they could do it as well. They just mustn't lose faith and hope. But yeah, EFF is in a good position to break that electoral image of what the country looks like and create your own bloc somewhere. Whether they do that or not, we'll find out. But all of this is like me being a political witch doctor and predicting the future, which I hate to do, but here we are.
Well, Dr. Chikane, all that's left is to thank you for your insights and for sharing some fascinating views on South African politics.
Yeah. I mean, they might change tomorrow. I might wake up and be like, wow.
That's perfectly fair.
Nah,
and I think
we're good.
Trolls of every single political party.
I'm an equal opportunity discriminator.
But no, you're definitely one of the most insightful thinkers on our politics. So thank you for helping our audience to
no problem.
Think through this crazy moment.
No, thanks for having me.
Look forward to having you back.
Yeah, soon, hopefully. We'll see.
Yeah. At least not 3 years.
Yeah, no, it won't be 3 years. It won't be 3 years.
Okay. Before the local elections, at least.
No, definitely.
Yeah.
Hopefully, we'll still have a GNU at that point. We'll find out.
We'll see.
It's tough out here.
Thank you, brother.
Thanks.
Thank you for watching. Help us get to 150,000 subscribers. And like, share, comment down below. Show some love for Dr. Chikane. And keep it locked on SMWX. Aye.